The whole point of buying a Lexus LX is that you probably don't want a vehicle like an Audi Q7 or a BMW X7. You want a vehicle with the durability of the Toyota Land Cruiser chassis, and that's what this vehicle is all about. It's what the LX has always been about. But the new J300 Lexus LX is a really interesting car for a bunch of reasons. There's two new engines, the interior is completely different to the old Lexus LX500 and Lexus LX450d, which we reviewed a bunch here on Chasing Cars, and the dynamics are quite different too because of the substantially revised platform underneath this car, which is shared with the 300 series Land Cruiser. So in today's comprehensive 2022 Lexus LX review, which we're filming down here in beautiful Tasmania, I'm going to take you through everything you need to know about this four-wheel drive, because it isn't really an SUV, it is a four-wheel drive. We'll jump inside the cabin, check out the interior. I'll recommend a specification that I think works best for this car. We'll check out the back seats, have a look at the boot, discuss the running costs, and then we'll head out onto the road and on gravel where this car is really at home to find out how the Lexus LX drives. Then I'll give you my verdict. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below and the notification bell. The interior of the new LX is really quite different to the 300 series Land Cruiser, with which it shares so much of its componentry. It's a different interior design, the technology is different, runs a different operating system, it works differently, and the center stack is actually quite unique to this car, and I think you'll either really like it or not. I'm not yet sold on it, to be honest. I actually quite liked the interior of the old LX. Maybe I was the only one, but I thought it had real presence and extremely high quality. That quality certainly carries over to the new car, but we now have this dual screen layout, 12.3 inches on top, 7 inches down the bottom. And this bottom screen presents the off-roading information, climate control. You can change some settings for the screens, but you've also got physical climate controls, which is good because they're a lot easier to use on bumpy roads, which is the whole point. You've then got controls for low range, off-road modes, etc. They're all physical and big knobbly things, which is good because, you know, when the car's moving around, you need it to be nice and easy. I just think the presentation is not familiar to me. It hasn't been used in any other Lexus products. It's probably just not quite used to it, but there was a real elegance to the old car, I thought, inside. But it's up to you, that's all subjective. What this car is though, is the F Sport. So that's why we're sitting on this two-tone black and red perforated leather with heating and cooling. Worth keeping in mind, the base car, which is the only 7-seat LX available in Australia, you can't get seat cooling for love nor money, which is a shame. The LX has had seat cooling for ages and it's a really good feature in a hot country. But if you want seat cooling, you can't have 7 seats. You have to spend more money on an F Sport, Sports Luxury, or the Ultra Luxury. But there you go, every car gets seat heating. What you can do is option the base car with a sunroof and with a kick sensor for the tailgate. But here in the F Sport, we get all of that stuff included. It's just a small sunroof rather than a panoramic device, but it's nice to have. Really beautiful soft headlining as well in this car. Soft leather here on the steering wheel, contrast stitching, soft materials basically everywhere you touch. Although my knee is pressed up against the center console, it has soft padding. It's just the vicissitudes of life mean that my proportions in my leg somehow mean that my knee is actually up against the silver trim here, which is a bit of a shame. F Sport gets this cool aluminium trim, but there's wood in most of the cars. It all presents very luxuriously. The seats themselves are big, lazy boy kind of armchairs. They're comfortable. I wouldn't mind a little bit more under thigh adjustment if I was to be really picky, but I did several hours in this car over the last couple of days in one stint and got out feeling refreshed, which is the whole point, right? The view out is also good. We've got big mirrors, digital rear view mirror, which is cool, or it can just be traditional like it is now. And the view over the bonnet, which is now aluminium, still looks awesome because it's got that beautiful sculpting out of it, helps you see off-road, just makes the car feel more powerful and pretty sweet when you're looking out. So that's the front. One thing I should mention, with the new operating system, wireless Apple CarPlay, the hardware is there. The car will be updated probably over the air later this year, like the new Lexus NX, but it is definitely happening in 2022. And all cars get a 23-speaker Mark Levinson reference stereo, which is one of the best I've ever heard. Recall that the Lexus LX is a body-on-frame four-wheel drive. It's not a unibody vehicle like a BMW X7 or a Volkswagen Golf. Instead, we're literally sitting on a separate chassis, and that's what makes the Land Cruiser and the LX so adept off-road. You don't have to be body-on-frame to be great off-road, but it certainly helps with significant articulation, which this vehicle is capable of. However, when you're then sitting someone in the back, it generally means that the floor is higher and your knees have to sit higher as a result. Lexus have been able to combat this relatively successfully by making the cushion of the back seat very long. So your feet and your knees are actually supported relatively well here in the back. You still get a little bit of float. It's not as comfortable as a Range Rover or an Audi Q7 in the second row, but it's totally fine. Headroom, I've got enough at 6 foot. Legroom is okay. It's probably not as much as you would think. And that's partially because the LX is not that long. It's about 5 meters long, which is still pretty long, but something like a Mazda CX-9 is actually a bigger car than this, which is a bit of a surprise. Shoulder room is okay. You could get an adult here easily, but we've got lots of fun amenities, which makes this car more comfortable for 4 than 5. So we've got air vents up here, air vents down here. We actually have quad zone climate control in this car, heating and cooling for the rear seats in the F Sport and Sports Luxury and Ultra Luxury, and a flip down armrest with cup holders. All feels very, very solid. Quality is excellent, and we've got plenty of grab handles too, plus sun blinds, which is always a nice feature and keeps the rays off the heads of little ones you might put back here, and then really cool detailing in the Mark Levinson speaker grills too. So the back seat is perfectly usable. Just don't forget that it's only the base LX grade that has 7 seats. For every other variant, you've got 5 or 4 in the Ultra Luxury, which will chuck a bit of B-roll here of, which is super opulent and is actually accounting for 10% of pre-orders, which is kind of interesting. Quite a few changes here at the back of the LX. We have the brand's new tail design language with a lit light bar connecting the 2 tail lights, which are quite new in shape. We also have Lexus written out here instead of the L mark, or the mark is still at the front of the vehicle and on the steering wheel, so you're not going to forget that. As I mentioned, this is the diesel. This is the LX500d in F Sport trim, so it does look a little bit more athletic, but you can very much go for the conventional looking, luxurious sort of LX styling with the base car or the Sports Luxury or the Ultra Luxury. Now, all cars get a power tailgate, one beep and then it opens up. And that tailgate is now single piece, which I know some people don't love. The LX and the 200 series Land Cruiser used to have a split tailgate, so you could kind of sit here. The toolkit was really nicely packaged in the bottom half of the split tailgate. But effectively, the single seal gives this car better prevention from dust intrusion on gravel road driving, and that's the main reason why Toyota and Lexus decided to move to a single frame door. You can take it or leave it. Now, depending on the specification of the car, the base model, which has 7 seats, the F Sport and Sports Luxury, which have 5 seats, and the Ultra Luxury, which has the crazy 4-seat package, the boot space differs. I'll put that up on screen now so you can see how big the boot is, or at least how big the claimed boot space is. Now, under the boot floor, we still have that nice toolkit, very, very neat. It's a big square. You're going to be able to get a lot of stuff in this vehicle. And don't forget that the 300 series actually took out the new record for most soccer balls in our testing back in Sydney, and this is fundamentally the same vehicle. You do actually have to option a kick sensor if you like that for your tailgate, but if you don't, then you don't have to. We've got controls here to close the tailgate or close it and lock the vehicle. And that's going to lead us on to our last segment before we hit the road, which is ownership costs. So what's it going to cost you to own and run a new Lexus LX? Well, I mean, running a large four-wheel drive is never cheap, and so it goes for this car, but it actually is quite a bit cheaper to run than the previous generation LX, because the new engines are considerably more fuel efficient, not just on paper, but also in our real-world testing. We've now driven a whole bunch of 300 series Land Cruisers with the 3.3 litre diesel that you can get in this car and is fitted to the white car behind me, and they all get 13 litres per 100 Ks, as has the LX500d in my testing down here in Tasmania. But the real surprise packet is the LX600 Petrol. The previous LX570 was an absolute pig when it came to fuel consumption. We often saw 30 litres per 100 Ks, insane. And when petrol's above $2 a litre, I mean, God help you. The LX600 is really good. I was able to get 14 litres per 100 Ks out of the car without trying too hard. I think if you drove conservatively, more so than me, you could probably do better. Still chews through a fair bit of fuel. That's worth saying. It's also worth saying there's no hybrid available on the LX yet, but one will almost certainly be coming before the end of this decade. So that's fuel consumption. In terms of servicing, like a 300 series Land Cruiser, you have to maintain the LX every 6 months or 10,000 kilometers, which is not as convenient as 12-month servicing, but for a heavy duty vehicle like this, some people really do believe it's necessary. Those services are capped for the first 6 at $495 a piece, but after that it goes uncapped. And lastly, the warranty on the vehicle is the new Lexus warranty, which is 5 years with unlimited kilometers. So what is the new Lexus LX like to drive? Well, it's honestly an interesting topic because it's quite different to the 200 series. Some componentry carried over from the 200 to the 300, but not that much. And there's some fundamental differences in the platform underneath this car, and the powertrain strategy is quite interesting too. So there's a fair bit for us to talk about, but I might start with what this car is best at, and that's gravel road compliance. I don't think there's another car that I've reviewed on Chasing Cars in hundreds of videos that has been as compliant and comfortable and settled on gravel as the Lexus LX, the new 2022 J300 version. This car was extensively engineered in Australia as well as Japan. So much validation work was carried out here in Australia, and you can really tell because it's obviously what this vehicle was designed to do. Spent a lot of its time on classic corrugated Australian gravel roads. And that is 80% of the road network in Australia. Naturally, it's not where 80% of people live, but one of the groups that will be interested in buying this car and should closely consider it is well-heeled people that have properties that are far-flung and down gravel roads, because this car has not a squeak, not a rattle, not a movement. It is so superb at soaking up gravel roads in this country. But back on the sealed stuff, like I am now, well, what is the LX like? Well, quite simply, it's just not as capable dynamically as a car-based SUV like an Audi Q7 and BMW X7 and Mercedes GLS. All of those vehicles have much more rigidity. That means they're able to corner in a more stable way. They can hold much more pace while cornering. You have to have a much higher degree of patience with any frame vehicle, and of course that includes the LX, the Land Cruiser, the Patrol, the Prado. They're all quite similar in that way. That being said, the LX is significantly improved over the previous car. Torsional rigidity for the TNGA F frame platform is up by 20%, which isn't a small increase. And you actually can hustle this car. It's almost sickeningly enjoyable to do it because you know that you're behind the wheel of a bus or an apartment block, which is over 2 tons. And yet it will hustle. It's just that it doesn't really want to. It prefers to be driven with some grace and some patience, which I think is fine. That said, the steering is considerably better than the previous generation J200 Lexus LX. The steering wheel itself is a little bit smaller, but the rack is quicker, so it's just a bit more rewarding to drive day to day, and it does feel less like a bus, which is always nice. There's plenty of body roll, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that there isn't, but we have adaptive variable suspension, which really helps. And I found that on road, the mode that you want is comfort mode. And that is because it just dials out some of the jitters. The body control's never that awesome. So normal mode was too stiff, I thought. Comfort is good. Sport and Sport Plus, I wouldn't even bother with those. And then off-road, you have a proper low-range transfer case. We did do quite a nice condensed but difficult loop in the LX. The main issue is going to be approach angle. The huge front fascia on the car just limits the kind of obstacles that you can drive over. But I can tell you that given that the Land Cruiser isn't being sold in America in 300 series guys, there'll be heaps of aftermarket stuff developed for the LX customers in the US. And so I think we'll be able to get some of those parts out here. So if you really want to build out a Lexus LX based off-roader, I think you'll be able to do it. But obviously not too many people will go that way. And that brings me on to the second group of people that I think would really get a lot out of the Lexus LX, and that's people that, even if you don't have a country property and you don't drive on gravel roads all the time, you want a large luxury four-wheel drive or large SUV which is going to last. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. The 300 series might not end up being as long lasting as other Land Cruisers, but I doubt it, because Toyota and Lexus are not going to wreck their reputation for building bomb-proof four-wheel drives over the sake of downsizing an engine. And of course, that is a sticking point, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But this car, the quality is so high. The build quality is sky high in this vehicle compared to, you know, more expensive rivals, to be honest. And everybody that I've known who's bought a Lexus LX has ended up keeping it for 10 years, 20 years, handing it down to kids, just having it as a family car that everybody loves. So even though this is expensive, if you're going to keep it for 20 years, you're going to see a lot of value out of this car. And as a full drive to keep, rather than to flip after 2 years, this is, you know, I would probably go this way if I was actually going to keep the car for a long time instead of something like a Q7, even though this isn't anywhere near as good to drive on road. So that's one thing. But on those downsized engines, I know some people don't love it, but we're hardly talking about like boosted 2-litre 4-cylinders, are we? There's two turbocharged V6 engines available for this car. The same diesel as you get in a Land Cruiser, 3.3 twin turbo, 227 kilowatts of power, 700 newton meters of torque. But more interestingly, I think you can get a petrol, because you can't get a petrol Land Cruiser in Australia. You can in some other places, but you can't here. So if you want a petrol 300 series, you need the LX600, which gets an updated version of the 3.5 litre petrol that you get in an LS, which is the flagship Lexus sedan. Still twin turbo, 305 kilowatts of power and 650 newton meters of torque, which is plenty. In fact, it's the same amount of torque that you got in a 200 series and J200 diesel V8. And the petrol really, really hustles. It is quick. American publications have been getting low 6s for 0 to 60 runs. I think in our metric 0 to 100, the thing will do 6.5 seconds, which is, you know, phenomenally quick for a huge vehicle like this. The diesel really hustles too. It does 0 to 100 times in the sort of 7.5 to 8 second range, which is great. But as you can hear, even though it sounds kind of cool and trucky, it is a diesel. And in this kind of leather-lined Lexus opulence, a petrol still feels proper. But I'm not going to tell you that it's as cheap to run, but the fuel economy improvement over the old LX570 is staggering. You know, in some situations it uses half as much fuel as the old V8, which is interesting and helpful. Now, there is that iForce Max hybrid in the Toyota Tundra and Sequoia, which are also on the TNGA F platform, like this car in the 300 series. So you can expect to see a petrol electric hybrid LX sometime in the next few years, but it's certainly not imminent. That's what Lexus is able to tell us. So for now, it's a choice between the 600 petrol or the 500d diesel. I can see the benefits of both. In terms of safety systems, we have the Lexus Safety Sense Plus, which is the latest gen of the Lexus safety technologies. The lane keep assist is like on the 300 series, it doesn't work all that well. Assisted driving on the BMW X7 is probably the benchmark in this segment. But stuff like the adaptive cruise is a lot smoother than before. We have AEB, there's reversing AEB, and there's also junction AEB that doesn't just detect oncoming cars, it also detects pedestrians at crossings and things, so it's quite hard to crash into things with this car, which is good given it is very large. So it's refined, the quality is very high, the gravel road compliance is particularly excellent. Hence why I say two groups of people should be interested in this car. People that need to get to their country properties down a lot of gravel and they want a car that isn't going to rattle itself to pieces. And then secondly, those that plan to keep the vehicle for a very long time. So those are my first impressions of the new Lexus LX. If you're after a large luxury full drive that has the durability and the underpinnings of a Toyota Land Cruiser, this is kind of your only option. Infiniti don't even sell their version of the Nissan Patrol in Australia anymore, and this is a really different proposition to a vehicle like a Range Rover or a GLS or a Q7 or an X7. It stands alone, it does its own thing, which is why a lot of people really like this vehicle. As for myself, I'm quite a fan of the LX600. That's probably how I'd spec the car, with the petrol engine, but now I'm keen to hear your view, so let me know down below in the comments what you think. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell, and as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.